The Pentagon just war-gamed World War III, and they lost. Not because of weak military, not because of bad strategy, but because America ran out of money in month 7. 7 months. That is how long the United States can fight a major war before the economy collapses, before the dollar breaks, before the entire financial system implodes. And right now, in late 2025, tensions with China over Taiwan are at an all-time high. Russia is pushing NATO in Eastern Europe. Iran is threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz, and America is standing on the edge of conflicts it cannot afford to fight. Here is what nobody is talking about. The Iraq War cost $2 trillion over 20 years. The Afghanistan War cost $2.3 trillion. That is $4.3 trillion for 2 wars against enemies with no air force. No navy, no advanced weapons. Now imagine a war with China, a country with the world's largest navy, hypersonic missiles, cyber weapons. A war that would shut down global supply chains, crash stock markets, send oil to $300 per barrel, and cost not $2 trillion but $10 trillion in the first year alone. And here is the terrifying reality. America is already broke. The national debt is $38 trillion. The deficit is $2 trillion per year. Interest payments are $1 trillion annually. There is no fiscal space to fight a war, no economic capacity to borrow trillions more, and no political will to raise taxes or cut entitlements to fund a conflict. The United States military is still the strongest in the world, but the United States economy can no longer afford to use it. The age of American military dominance is not ending because of enemies. It is ending because of debt. Before we break down why America cannot afford another war and what happens if one starts anyway, hit that subscribe button and join the Wealth Forum. We expose the economic realities that politicians will not tell you, and show you how to protect your wealth when the system breaks. Turn on notifications. What comes next will change how you see America's future forever. Now let's talk about how we got here, and why this is different from every war America has fought before. Let's go back to World War II, the most expensive war in American history. In today's dollars, World War II cost $4.7 trillion. And America won, decisively. But here is how it was paid for. War bonds. Americans bought $186 billion in war bonds. Taxes. The top marginal tax rate hit 94%. And inflation. The government printed money and inflation eroded the real cost of the debt. It worked because the entire economy was mobilized. Every factory converted to war production. Every citizen sacrificed. And after the war, America was the only industrial power left standing. Europe was destroyed. Japan was occupied. And America dominated global trade for 50 years. But that was then. This is now. And every single condition that allowed America to finance World War II no longer exists. In 1941, the national debt was 40% of GDP. Manageable. Today, it is 130% of GDP. In 1941, Social Security and Medicare did not exist. Today, they consume 40% of the budget, and they are untouchable. In 1941, the top tax rate was 81% and went to 94% during the war. Today, it is 37%, and raising it is political suicide. In 1941, America had fiscal space to borrow. Today, America is already borrowing $2 trillion per year just to keep the lights on. Here is the math. A major war with China would cost $10 trillion in the first year, maybe more. Where does that money come from? The federal government collects $5 trillion in revenue annually, but it already spends $7 trillion. That is a $2 trillion deficit before any war. If war breaks out, spending would double, maybe triple. The deficit would explode to $5 trillion per year, and the government would have to borrow all of it. But who is going to lend America $5 trillion in a single year? Not China, not Japan, not Europe. They are already selling US treasuries. Domestic buyers cannot absorb that much debt, which means the Federal Reserve has to step in, print money, buy bonds, and flood the economy with trillions in new currency. And when you print trillions in a short time, you get inflation. Not 5%, not 10%, but 20, 30, 40%. Hyperinflation, the kind that destroys savings, collapses currencies, and turns stable economies into Venezuela. This is not speculation. This is what happens when governments try to finance wars they cannot afford. And it has happened to every empire in history. Rome, Spain, France, Britain. All of them financed wars with debt and debasement, and all of them collapsed. Here is the simple analogy. You make $100,000 per year, but you already spent $140,000. You borrow $40,000 annually just to survive. Now imagine you need to fight a lawsuit that costs $200,000 in the first year. Where does the money come from? You max out credit cards, take loans from family, sell assets, and eventually you go bankrupt. That is America. The lawsuit is the war, and bankruptcy is hyperinflation and dollar collapse. Now let's talk about the mechanics. How does a war actually break the economy? What are the stages? And at what point does the financial system implode? Stage 1 is the initial shock. War breaks out. Let's say China invades Taiwan. The first thing that happens is panic. Global stock markets crash 30% in a week. Oil spikes to $200 per barrel. The US imposes sanctions on China. China retaliates, and suddenly, half of global trade freezes. Shipping routes close. Supply chains collapse, and the price of everything explodes. But here is the part most people miss. China is America's largest trading partner. The US imports $500 billion in goods from China every year. Electronics, clothing, pharmaceuticals, medical equipment. If that trade stops, those goods disappear. Shelves go empty. Prices skyrocket. And the US economy grinds to a halt. This is not theoretical. During COVID, a tiny supply chain disruption caused massive shortages. A war with China would be 100 times worse. Stage 2 is the mobilization cost. The Pentagon estimates a war with China would require 500,000 troops, full carrier battle groups, air superiority campaigns, and sustained operations across the Pacific. The cost, $3 billion per day. That is $90 billion per month, over $1 trillion per year. And that is just direct military spending. It does not include veterans' benefits, infrastructure damage, or economic losses. Total cost, closer to $10 trillion in the first year. And here is the problem. America does not have a draft. The military is all volunteer, which means you have to pay soldiers competitive wages. During World War II, soldiers were paid $50 per month. Today, the average military salary is $60,000 per year. To mobilize 500,000 additional troops, you need $30 billion per year just in salaries, then equipment, training, logistics, medical care. The costs compound exponentially, and there is no way to cut corners without losing the war. Stage 3 is the borrowing crisis. The government issues $5 trillion in new bonds to fund the war, but the bond market rebels. Investors demand higher yields to compensate for risk. Treasury yields spike from 5% to 8%, then 10%, then 12%, and at 12% interest, the debt becomes mathematically unsustainable. The interest payments alone would be $4.5 trillion per year on $38 trillion in debt. That is almost the entire federal budget, just for interest. The system breaks. Stage 4 is the Federal Reserve intervention. When the bond market fails, the Fed steps in. It announces unlimited quantitative easing. It buys $5 trillion in treasury bonds, creates $5 trillion odd in new money, and that money floods the economy. At first it works. The government can keep spending, but then inflation returns. Consumer prices rise 5% per month, then 10%, then 15%. Groceries double in price. Gas hits 10 per gallon. And wages cannot keep up. The middle class is wiped out. Stage 5 is the currency crisis. As inflation spirals, foreign countries lose confidence in the dollar. They stop accepting dollars for trade. Oil-producing nations demand payment in yuan or euros or gold. The dollar's reserve currency status ends. And when that happens, the flood of dollars held overseas comes rushing back to America. Trillions in excess dollars return home. And domestic inflation accelerates to hyperinflation. Prices double every month. The currency becomes worthless. And the economy collapses into chaos. This is not fiction. This is the playbook of every empire that financed war beyond its means. And it always ends the same way. Economic collapse, currency destruction, and the end of global dominance. The mechanics are inevitable. The only question is timing. Now let's talk about the crisis, the exact scenarios where this could happen, and how close we are to the breaking point. Here is the breaking point, and it is closer than anyone wants to admit. There are 3 flashpoints where war could start: Taiwan, Ukraine, or Iran. Let's go through each. Flashpoint 1 is Taiwan. China has made it clear. Taiwan will be reunified by 2027 if possible, by force if necessary. And the United States has made it equally clear. We will defend Taiwan. President Biden said it explicitly 3 times. So here is the scenario. China blockades Taiwan, cuts off all shipping, surrounds the island with warships, and waits for Taiwan to surrender. The US responds with naval forces. A carrier battle group enters the Taiwan Strait. China fires warning shots. The US fires back. And within hours, we are at war. Now here is what happens economically. The US imposes total sanctions on China, freezes Chinese assets, bans all trade. China retaliates, dumps $800 billion in US treasuries, floods the bond market. Treasury yields spike, the dollar crashes, stock markets collapse, and the US economy enters recession. All of this happens in week 1, before a single major battle. The economic damage from a Taiwan war would eclipse the military cost, and it would be permanent. Flashpoint 2 is Ukraine. Right now, the war is contained. The US sends weapons but no troops. But what if Russia escalates? What if Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons or attacks a NATO member state? Article 5 gets triggered, and suddenly the United States is at war with Russia. A nuclear power, a war that could go nuclear in hours. The economic impact would be immediate. Energy markets collapse as Russian gas is cut off. Europe goes into recession. Global trade freezes. And the US has to mobilize for a war it cannot afford and cannot win. Flashpoint 3 is Iran. Iran has been threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz for years. 20% of global oil passes through that strait. If Iran closes it, oil goes to $300 per barrel. The global economy crashes, and the US is forced to respond militarily. A war with Iran would require naval blockades, airstrikes, and potentially ground operations. The cost would be trillions, and the economic fallout would be catastrophic. Because unlike Iraq, Iran has advanced weapons. Missiles that can sink aircraft carriers, cyber capabilities that can attack US infrastructure, and alliances with China and Russia. This would not be a quick war. It would be a decade-long quagmire that bleeds America dry. And here is the truly terrifying part. These flashpoints are not isolated. They are connected. If war breaks out in Taiwan, Russia might invade Ukraine knowing the US cannot fight on 2 fronts. If war breaks out in Ukraine, Iran might close the strait knowing the US is distracted. And if war breaks out in Iran, China might take Taiwan knowing America is overextended. Each conflict triggers the others, and the United States cannot afford to fight one, let alone 3. The Pentagon knows this. In war games conducted in 2023 and 2024, the US lost every simulation of a 2-front war, not because of military weakness, but because of economic collapse. The simulations showed that by month 7, the US runs out of money. The Treasury cannot borrow. The Fed cannot print fast enough, and the economy implodes. The war is lost not on the battlefield, but in the bond market. And here is the political reality. Even if America could afford the war financially, it cannot afford it politically. The American public has no appetite for war. Iraq and Afghanistan destroyed trust in military intervention. 70% of Americans oppose sending troops to Ukraine. 60% oppose defending Taiwan militarily. And there is no draft, no mechanism to mobilize millions of soldiers. The all-volunteer military caps at 1.3 million active duty personnel. If war requires 2 million troops, where do they come from? You cannot fight a major war without a draft, and you cannot implement a draft without massive civil unrest. So here is the breaking point. War breaks out, the economy crashes, inflation spikes, the draft is proposed, protests erupt. The government cannot borrow, the Fed prints, hyperinflation begins, and within a year America looks like Weimar Germany. The superpower falls not to an enemy, but to its own debt. Now let's talk about the consequences. What happens when America can no longer project military power? And what does a world without American dominance look like? Here is what happens when America can no longer afford war, and what you need to understand about the New World Order. Consequence 1 is the end of Pax Americana. For 80 years, American military dominance has kept global peace, or at least prevented major power wars. But if America cannot afford to defend Taiwan, or Ukraine, or the Middle East, that era ends. China takes Taiwan. Russia takes Ukraine. Iran dominates the Persian Gulf, and regional powers fill the vacuum. The world does not become more peaceful. It becomes more chaotic, more violent, and more dangerous. Consequence 2 is the collapse of alliances. NATO exists because America guarantees European security. But if America cannot afford to defend Europe, why would Europe stay in NATO? Japan and South Korea rely on American protection. But if America cannot afford to defend them, they will build their own militaries. Or worse, align with China. The alliance system that has defined global politics since 1945 fractures, and every country is on its own. Consequence 3 is the economic shock. If war with China closes the Taiwan Strait, 90% of advanced semiconductors stop being produced. Every smartphone, every computer, every car, every weapon system, all depend on chips made in Taiwan. If Taiwan falls, the global tech industry collapses. supply chains freeze, and the world enters a depression worse than 2008. This is not hypothetical. Industry experts estimate that a Taiwan war would cost the global economy 10 trillion in the first year alone, and recovery would take decades. Consequence 4 is the dollar collapse. If America cannot afford war, foreign nations lose confidence in American power. And if they lose confidence in American power, they lose confidence in the dollar. Countries start trading in yuan, in euros, in gold. The dollar loses reserve currency status, and when that happens, the inflation that America has been exporting for 80 years comes home. Prices explode, savings evaporate, and the American standard of living collapses to third world levels. Consequence 5 is domestic chaos. When the economy collapses and the dollar fails, people lose faith in institutions, trust in government vanishes, social unrest escalates, and the country fractures. This is not fear-mongering. This is what happens when empires fall. Rome, Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. They all followed the same pattern: overextension, debt, war, collapse, and America is on the same path. So what do? Here is the plan. First, understand that American military dominance is ending not because of military weakness, but because of economic reality. This changes everything. Foreign policy, defense strategy, global trade, everything. Second, prepare for a multipolar world. A world where China dominates Asia, Russia dominates Eastern Europe, and regional powers compete without a global hegemon. This world is more unstable, more dangerous, and more unpredictable. Third, protect your wealth. If war breaks out, stock markets will crash, the dollar will collapse, and inflation will explode. Move assets into hard stores of value: gold, real estate, foreign currencies, anything that holds value when paper currencies fail. Fourth, diversify geographically. If America enters economic crisis, you do not want all your wealth in dollar-denominated assets. Hold assets in other countries, other currencies, other systems, because when one system fails, others may survive. And fifth, prepare mentally for a world where America is no longer the superpower, where the rules have changed, and where survival depends on adaptability. The age of American dominance is ending, not because of China, not because of Russia, but because America can no longer afford the empire it built. So here is the lesson. America's military is still the strongest in the world, but military strength is meaningless without economic capacity. And America no longer has the economic capacity to fight major wars. The debt is too high, the deficits are too large, the interest payments are too consuming, and the political will is too weak. The Pentagon can wargame all it wants, but the real constraint is not strategy, it is money. History teaches us that empires fall when they can no longer afford their ambitions. Rome fell not because of barbarians, but because it could no longer pay its soldiers. Spain fell not because of enemies, but because its silver mines ran dry. Britain fell not because of Germany, but because it bankrupted itself, fighting 2 world wars. And America will follow the same pattern if it tries to fight wars it cannot afford. The unsettling truth is this: the world is about to become much more dangerous, not because America is weak, but because America is broke, and a broke superpower is more dangerous than no superpower at all, because it creates a vacuum, and history shows us that power vacuums are always filled, usually by war. So here is what you do. If this video made you realize that America cannot afford another war and the world is about to change forever, smash that like button. Subscribe to the Wealth Forum. Turn on notifications. Share this with anyone who still believes American military power is unlimited.